Everyone. We will get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. Thank you everyone who is joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Maine Climate Advocates in Egypt, and to all the viewers watching on YouTube. Last month, the 27th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as COP27, took place in the Egyptian coastal city of Sharm el-Sheikh. In UN nomenclature, parties refers to the 197 nations that agreed to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change back in 1992. With that treaty, the world's nations, including the United States, pledged to address the dangerous human interference with the climate system and to stabilize levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And they've gathered every year since to figure out how to collectively meet that commitment. More than 35,000 delegates were expected to attend COP27, including President Biden, more than 100 heads of state, and some of our very favorite climate advocates. We are delighted to welcome 4 Mainers who recently traveled to Sharm el-Sheikh. Representative Chellie Pingree has recorded a very special video message just for us. And joining us live are Maine Law Associate Professor Anthony Moffa, former MCV intern and member of Colby College's class of 2024, Chloe Shader, and current MCV intern and member of Maine Law's class of 2023, Mikala Bolmer. We are so excited to hear your firsthand behind-the-scenes perspective on COP27. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of those and ask them following the presentation at the end. We ask that you not message speakers directly as we want their attention on the presentation and not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, send a message to Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. Professor Moffa, I will turn it over to you to start us off with some background on the annual Conference of Parties.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Kathleen, and thanks MCV for hosting this and for lending us your interns to be part of our delegation in Egypt this year. Just by way of background, I think you did a bit of it already, but I think it's useful just to get people thinking in the framework of what exactly we're talking about when we say COP27. And so, as you correctly stated, COP27, the phrase COP, or the acronym COP, stands for Conference of the Parties, parties being the countries who are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. Sometimes you'll hear people call it that, right? It is sort of the landmark foundational agreement on addressing climate change at a global scale that we have that we've come to, and we came to that agreement, the initial agreement, in 1992 in Rio, some 27 years ago. Since then, right, we've had Conference of the Parties every year. Perhaps some of these go relatively unremarked upon. Nothing, lasting comes out of them other than reaffirming commitments in prior years. Other negotiations are much more, make much bigger splash, and perhaps none more so than COP21, which was in Paris. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a separate agreement that was reached by the parties at COP21. That agreement is the one where countries pledged to make changes to keep global warming, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and try aspirationally to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius as the goal for warming over the next century. To do that, countries at Paris committed to submitting what are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which are individual commitments of countries to cut greenhouse gases within their borders. And so that was a monumental decision in terms of shaping not only global climate policy, but also all the subsequent COPs. Because now when you attend a conference of the parties, the negotiations don't just focus on that foundational agreement, but also on the commitments that were made at Paris, especially with respect to mitigation, but also with respect to what we call in the business adaptation, right? Making communities more resilient to the oncoming effects of climate change. There were some commitments made at Paris to that, and subsequent COPs have focused on trying to make progress on those commitments, particularly transfers of technology and frankly, financial assistance to countries to adapt to climate change. That was going into COP27 in Egypt, something that there was a lot of focus on. Another thing that we saw focus on, rather hopefully from an advocacy standpoint going into COP27, was a recognition that there's a third category to be concerned about besides mitigation and adaptation. And that third category is what we call loss and damage. And loss and damage refers to harms from climate change that have already been experienced or are going to be experienced. In other words, they can't be prevented by adaptation. And those harms often result in serious losses of life and money in countries, oftentimes countries that had very little to do with the problem and are particularly susceptible to ongoing climate harms. Think small island nations, for instance. And so there was a big focus coming into COP27 on whether something could get done on loss and damage. And kind of to, play the spoiler here, there was, in fact, an agreement reached kind of at the 11th hour on the establishment, at least in principle, of a loss and damage financial instrument to transfer money to countries that experience that kind of harm. In terms of how these negotiations work logistically, our delegation was a delegation of what we call an observer delegation to the treaty negotiations, which means that we were not a party. We weren't representing a country. We were there as observers. The observer organization we were part of was the University of Maine, except for obviously Chloe was with Colby College. The University of Maine delegation was around 10 of us over 2 weeks. And observers at these negotiations have the opportunity to sit in on the actual negotiations themselves, which take place not only in those big sort of UN rooms that you see with the placards and the screens, but also in side rooms where individual elements of the negotiations are happening. So we were sitting in on those negotiations regarding the text, and Mikala, I'm sure, will talk a little bit more about that. You also have the opportunity to attend what are called official side events within the conference, which are places where scientists and policy experts are making presentations about their research and about different challenges that we're facing with respect to global climate change. And then we also had the opportunity to visit the country pavilions, which I often liken to like an auto show for countries' climate policies, right? So each country that has a pavilion is like, it's a fancy setup to display what that country is doing. And often those pavilions also featured programming by, people from that country and from others. We spent some time at many of those different pavilions, which I'm sure you'll hear about from Mikala and Chloe as well. So that's how we engaged when we were there over the course of the 2 weeks. We had some opportunities to meet with some high-level folks from the United States, and primarily from the United States, but also from elsewhere, to try to talk about what our priorities might be in terms of our status as an observer organization, but also just in our own research. And so those were some productive conversations as well. But I don't want to take too much of our time just setting the table. So I think that gives you a good picture of kind of what we were there to do and what it was that we were attending. So I'll pass it to Congresswoman Pingree, I think.
Thanks for that intro. And yeah, we'll let the Congresswoman tell us about her experience in Egypt.
Sorry I can't be there with you in person today. I'm still in Washington, but it's great to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about COP27. I was so privileged to be able to attend as part of the Speaker Pelosi party. And it's a whole different experience when you're traveling with the speaker. You do a lot of meetings, you know, whether it's with Secretary Kerry or former Vice President Al Gore, or spending nearly an hour with the president of Egypt talking about human rights violations. We really reached a wide range of individuals that we got a chance to talk to and to be updated about the progress of where we were during the time that we were there. I'd love to spend many more days. It's such an interesting opportunity, and there's so many people there who you want to connect with and talk about the things that you're interested, particularly for me, working with Secretary Vilsack on our climate change and agriculture sort of our plan around that. I got a chance to see really agricultural secretaries from countries all over the world talking about the progress that they're making and the challenges that they're facing, and we know that the challenges are many. Perhaps the most important thing to come out of COP27 this year, as most people know, were the agreements around loss and damage. We know that so many countries around the world, from African countries, desert nations, island nations that are sinking into the sea, are really suffering the impact of climate change that's been made by Western countries like ours. I heard someone say at COP26, you know, many of them provided the slaves that built the Industrial Revolution in our country, which is basically what got us to the place that we are now with excess carbon. And now we're destroying their countries again. So it's a double punishment for them. And it is absolutely our responsibility to support those nations, to help them to make the transition to renewable energy, but also just to get through this difficult time we're in when so many of them are dealing with the front lines of the challenges of climate change. Clearly, we need to do so much more on capping our use of fossil fuels. I don't think anybody felt we got far enough on that. I was particularly pleased we had an entire day devoted to agriculture and climate change. So often that's been left off the conversation. Agriculture contributes about 10% of the greenhouse gases, but it also can be an enormous partner in sequestering carbon. And much of the work I've been doing here in Washington is related to what we do with domestic agriculture, but we have to be working on this worldwide. We have a lot of partners who are moving forward even faster than us. So our work is cut out for us. This was my second COP, and I think if you look at the many years that COPs are being held, we know that each year we move forward, and clearly we have to move much faster. That's my goal. I'm glad that the United States was finally there. We were an active participant, and we could say that we had passed the biggest bill, the biggest investment in reducing our climate change footprint here in the United States. So it was nice to be there showing that we had actually done something. But we've got our work cut out for us. There's going to be a challenging Congress coming up, and I look forward to working with all of you on the many things that are so important to us, and having Maine as a partner where so much good work is being done. So thank you all. Look forward to talking to you. Oh, and by the way, it was great to meet the Mainers who are over there meeting with the delegation, some of the students who were there from UMO, meeting with some of the people who were there from Colby College. I wish I had gotten to see all the Mainers who were there, and it's so exciting to see them present. So take care. Good to see you all.
All right, it was a windy day in Washington yesterday, but I hope everybody could hear the enthusiasm and the pride for the work that we have done. It's no surprise to anybody on this call that the last year of work advocating for the Inflation Reduction Act was grueling and a real roller coaster for a lot of us, but I can only imagine how exciting it must have been to walk into those meetings in Egypt and say, yeah, we did it. We passed the biggest investment and most historic legislation around climate action in US history. Feels pretty good. So Thank you. With that, without further ado, let's hear from Chloe and then from Mikala about what it's like to be a student. I don't know about any of you, but wow, that was not a part. International climate negotiations were certainly not a part of my undergraduate experience. Chloe, I'm so glad you got to go. What was it like?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here on this Zoom and also feel so grateful that I got the chance to go to Egypt. It was really a really super cool experience. And essentially I'm majoring in environmental policy at Colby. And so I took this class last spring with Professor Stacey Ann Robinson called Global Climate Policy. And that's how I got the chance to come to Egypt. At first, it was really overwhelming, and like there was so much going on, and I was like, "Oh my goodness! Like, how do I even like find these buildings?" And like trying to contextualize myself within like what the negotiations were happening at that moment, because I went during the second week, so everything had already been going for a while. But eventually, I definitely got the hang of it more, and got to talk to some of the wonderful people from Maine who were very nice in helping figure out where I should go and what to do. One of my favorite moments looking back at my experience was the professor that I went with, Nadia El-Shawari. She teaches like global studies stuff. Both of us were in like observing a negotiation about the Santiago protocols, which is about like connecting vulnerable countries to resources and like information sharing. Um, and all of the parties in that negotiation were really upset with each other. They were like, we stayed up all night and we tried so hard on this, and now you guys are moving backwards. And they said it very professionally. They said a lot of like, my colleague, my colleagues are moving backwards. I thought that was funny. So we were in there for like an hour and 20 minutes, and whoever was in charge of the meeting, the co-chairs were like, okay, it's time to take a break. So they took a break and they said it was going to be a 20-minute break. And the professor I was with and I were like, it's lunchtime. Like, it doesn't seem like this meeting is going anywhere. Like, let's go get some pizza. So we went to go get some food. And as we were sitting and eating our pizza, I got a WhatsApp message that they had come to a conclusion, like super fast, like 10 minutes after their break, they came to an agreement. So I think that story is like really like sometimes it's easy to feel like you can give up on these things, but it just takes a little bit more pushing. It just takes a 20-minute break and like some water. And I don't know, my experience with like the historic loss and damage agreement that was passed was kind of similar. Like that happened after the conference was supposed to be over. They had to extend it for it to happen. So I was on the plane coming home from Egypt, like, I don't know if anything's going to happen. Like when I left on Friday, it didn't seem super optimistic. It seemed like people were really divided. So I don't know. And also I was really tired. So maybe that's part of it. I was kind of worried and feeling like nothing was going to happen. And then it did again, a second time. So those are my stories of, I think sometimes it can be easy to say that nothing happens in these meetings, but things really do, especially when you stick with it. And give it the time that it needs sometimes to keep going. My other favorite parts from the meetings were the people's plenary, which was this really like the plenary meetings are the biggest meetings that happen. So it's like huge rooms. I don't know how many because I'm really bad at estimating numbers, but a huge amount of people. And in the people's plenary, usually they have the plenaries with like every country that's there, and that's where they make like the big overarching decisions. But the people's plenary was with like activists and like frontline organizers from all around the world, and they had representatives from like many different communities and like representatives from many different like groups, like women in the global south and disabled people and all of that kind of stuff. And it was really cool to have that kind of global summit on like activism and to be able to witness that and be a part of it. And it was very like participatory, and people were clapping and stamping their feet on the floor. And it was just a really exciting, inspiring thing to be a part of. And yeah, that's my summary of my experience thus far, but there's definitely a lot of stuff that happened. And overall, I'm just really grateful that I got to experience it.
Thank you so much, Chloe. I am so grateful that you got to go. Chloe, we had the good fortune at MCV to work with Chloe this time well, I guess a little bit after. It was Jan Plan last year, right? That Chloe was an intern with MCV, and we just remember her name. She's going places. We are all lucky to have her. And I'm so glad that you're building your international career already.
Thank you so much.
Let's hear from Mikala next. Mikala is a current MCV intern. She is working, has been working with us all semester. She's in her last year at Maine Law. And remember this name as well, because wow, we are lucky to have some really phenomenal climate advocates coming up through the ranks here in Maine. And Mikala, tell us about your time. I know you've got some slides to help us put some images to the excitement.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, for that very kind introduction. That's so generous. I have really, really enjoyed being an intern, extern, whatever you want to call it, for MCV. And in that capacity, I've gotten to have this opportunity to go to COP. So, I don't think any other MCV interns or externs get to say that. And I'm just incredibly grateful and honored. I got to be the first Maine Law student who went. So for all of those reasons, like, that's so much faith put in me and so much like responsibility. And I'm just really humbled and grateful. And I want to share some of what Chloe and Professor Moffa have been talking about with like some slides. So here we go. So before we went to COP, Professor Moffa and I, like he said, we were part of the UMaine delegation. So we had some Zoom meetings to talk about what to expect and what we might be trying to focus on, because like Chloe said, it's very overwhelming and there's so much to do at any given time. And so these are a few of the things that I tried to look at before I went. So over here, this colorful one, that's maybe not even 1 hour of one day of a 2-week conference. These are the side events. And so that I spent hours and hours and hours going through that. This is the COP agenda that they released in August, but it was very short, but it didn't actually have any like schedules or any timing of when things were supposed to happen. So that one was incredibly confusing. This is another schedule. What I ended up doing ultimately was trying to kind of go through it all and figure out what the acronyms meant. So this was a 31-page Google Doc that I made of acronyms, and the pink ones are ones that I haven't ever actually figured out what they stand for. But that was kind of how I approached this giant unknown of like, what am I getting to and what am I going to be doing? And it was better than nothing, but it was, pretty inadequate. So, we arrived, and for those of you who don't know, I didn't know Sharm el-Sheikh is on the Sinai Peninsula here. So we arrived for the second week of COP. It's 2 weeks long, and you can split up a badge so that one person can be on the badge for the first week and another person can be on the second week. So we flew in here, and there was this lovely greeting at the airport. Oops, excuse me. And this is a little bit of what the terrain looked like there. There were lots of Mediterranean style houses. There was lots of open flat space with big mountains in the background, not very much vegetation, quite scrubby. And then these big wide open roads that were often quite empty, like they are right here. And we would have to run Frogger our way across them because there weren't very many crosswalks. So that was a little bit of what greeted us. And then on the very first day, we got our picture taken outside. This is the second week UMaine delegation. So there's Professor Moffa right there. And these 3 other folks are professors from UMO, University of Maine in Orono. And so we got our badges, and our badges were our key to get everywhere. And you could get another badge, but you really wanted to hold tight to that, because without that, you couldn't get anywhere. And so we would come into this little green zone right here, or this green building, excuse me. The green zone was 2 completely other things. We would come into this green building and have our badges swiped, and then boop, we'd pop right out here. And then we'd be in this entire complex. And like Chloe said, I anyway spent a decent portion of my time there trying to navigate because it's so big. There's a little walking guide down here that says that like to get from over here to over here, this purple section here should take about 10 minutes. My watch was telling me I was walking miles and miles a day. So, figuring out where each of the rooms and the pavilions and the meetings and the negotiations and all of that was a real challenge. There were many, many maps. I've got some of them here. Another group actually took over the map making and spread them around because the official maps were so poorly done. So as you can see, that part of it was pretty overwhelming. And then this was a schedule. This isn't even a full schedule for one of the days. This was the CCTV schedule. So this was what we would be looking at to see which negotiations were ongoing and when, and where, and if they were open to observers. So this would get updated. We would look back at it fairly regularly, like throughout the day, multiple times a day, to see if we needed, if there was something happening that we wanted to be at that was across the way. And so kind of keeping track of all of those things was a pretty big hurdle to begin with. And then you actually got in there, and here's what some of the pavilions looked like. So Professor Moffa likened it to the auto show. I like to compare it to like Spirit Week in high school and Color Day. And I don't know if this is a universal experience, but at my high school on Color Day, the various grades got to decorate various corners of the cafeteria with their grades color. And it was like this moment to kind of show off and show how creative you could be and kind of how lavish you could be. And like, it was, and so it, I was really getting those vibes from the pavilion areas. So here's a few more photos of kind of walking through, and a lot of it ended up feeling very same, but the pavilions were these gorgeous spaces set up by, like Professor Moffa said, sometimes like by the countries, other times they were by observer NGOs. So over here, these are mostly observer NGO spaces. These are some really small pavilions. And then there were some that were really big. So this is part of Egypt's pavilion. And that is not real marble, I checked, but this is part, like one, I think there were 3 other sections, 2 or 3 other sections like about this size for Egypt's pavilion. So, you know, this one little box right over here is one pavilion, and then this is a portion of one pavilion. So they weren't all created equal. And then here is the UAE, which is hosting COP28 next year. This is their pavilion, very spacious, going on and on. So you could have spent 2 whole weeks just walking around the pavilion spaces and looking and listening to the events that were happening. Here's another pretty one. And this was considered the Africa COP. There have been a series of COPs in Africa, and this is, I think, the last one, yeah, before it moves to the UAE. And so we finally found our way to some negotiations after orienting in the pavilion areas a little bit. And the first one that Professor Moffa and I were in was the global goal on adaptation, which is, he described it a little bit. It's one of the goals that was laid out from a previous COP. And so we were in this room over here with this facilitator bank up here at the front, and they were talking about this document and what, you know, how the various country parties felt about the provisions in the document. And I was just sitting there like, I have no idea what they're talking about. So Professor Moffa was able to find, and I'm going to kind of walk us all through it here. He was able to show me how to find the session documents. So we would go to the COP27 page here, and we would sessions and documents, and then we had to know whether we were in the COP27 session or a CMP, that's the Paris Agreement session, or the CMA was the Kyoto Protocol. Oops, I got those backwards. CMA is Paris, CMP is Kyoto Protocol. And I think, I'm not going to remember quite right here. Let's see. I did. Okay, so this is the negotiation we were in, 6C of the CMA 4. And so we had to come here, and if you click on that, then there's documents here, and then you download the documents, and then hopefully they pop up. Yep. And then you scroll through, and now there's paragraph numbers. So the countries would be going through and saying, we support paragraph 1, we support paragraph 3, we want to take out the word program in paragraph 6, you know. And some of these documents also had options. So, you know, paragraph 12 would be highly contentious, and the G77 plus China, that's the group of 77 plus China, is a negotiating group of parties. It's 134 countries altogether. So the G77 plus China felt really strongly one way on paragraph 12. And then the UK, the US, the EU, and Canada and Australia all felt a different way about paragraph 12. And so in the documents that they'd be negotiating, there would be option 1 for paragraph 12, and there'd be option 2 for paragraph 12. Sometimes there were up to like 4 or 5 options for one paragraph, and they would in these negotiations work on finding what they called convergence areas. So they'd say like, okay, well, we can accept the language of option 2 for paragraph 12, but option 4 is totally unacceptable. So, you know, if you weren't able to do what Moffa showed me how to do and go through and find these documents, then you'd be sitting in these big rooms. Let's see, can I get back to my slideshow? Here we go. You'd be sitting in these big rooms and and they'd be talking and you'd kind of just be like, I have no idea what they're talking about, because they weren't talking about substantive stuff. They were talking about paragraph 7, option 4, you know, and that doesn't mean anything. And so you had to be able to find these documents, and you can see right here on my computer that that was in fact exactly what I was learning how to do when I took this picture. And so that was what we spent a lot of the time in the negotiations doing, was following through the documents and listening to what the negotiators were saying. And over here is just another layout of a different room that was used for negotiations. So, but there would still be a bank of facilitators. So along one side in the middle would be a similar set of folks like here in this picture on the left, that would be facilitating the negotiation. And so this one, I believe, is from a loss and damage negotiation, and it was in one of the plenary rooms that Chloe was talking about. So it was hundreds and hundreds of parties and observers, all trying to speak their piece on a document. And these are some of the notes that I took from the first loss and damage negotiation that I was in. And every single country who spoke, again, this is just a very small sample of a pretty long chunk of notes that I took. Every country that spoke said, we didn't have enough time to reflect. We didn't have enough time with the document. We didn't get the document in time, even though we were up all night reading it, we still haven't had enough time to read, you know. And so there were these procedural barriers that would get in the way of the negotiations too, because when a country hasn't had enough time to process what they're expected to then have opinions on, that's just not a very fair ask to ask the countries to then agree to things that they haven't had time to process, like not very fair. So there were substantive disagreements, there were procedural disagreements. And it was all, I thought, incredibly fascinating, and it was exactly where I wanted to be. But ultimately we would burn out in a day. You know, we'd be there from 8:45 to 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, and we would just need to go home. And the negotiations would go on, like that CCTV schedule would go until midnight, 2 a.m. You know, those schedules just kept coming up as the negotiations kept coming up. They kept getting put on the schedule, but we would ultimately leave and go back to our Airbnb and try to find dinner. And we did finish a puzzle because our Airbnb didn't have Wi-Fi, although Moffa was able to bring some mobile Wi-Fi. And there's amazing snorkeling there. So there was a rest day, and there were a couple other days available to us to go snorkeling. Best snorkeling I've ever done. It was truly, I don't have an underwater camera, but if you Google Sharm el Sheikh snorkeling, like just gorgeous, so much fun, and networking. So this is Nick, he was on our delegation, but then these two other folks were other COP observers, but they were not from our delegation. And this picture was taken with about 20 more non-UMaine people as well. So we were networking while we were having this kind of fun, and we ate so much food, all kinds of gorgeous food, and lots and lots of bread. And we walked around the markets a little bit in search of ice cream. There were some gorgeous sights in general to be seen. So this was a mosque at one of the markets. And then market with spices. The mangoes were so good. I really wish I'd smuggled a few back in my bag, although perhaps they would have caught me at customs, but they are top notch, so good. I miss them a lot. And there's Chloe. Hi, Chloe. But we went out one night and we actually picked the fish that we were going to have cooked and brought to our table. So here's our table, and here's the fish that we were picking out in that first picture there. And this is a view from one of the beaches that we were able to get to. So it wasn't all negotiations for us all the time, but we did spend, like I said, significant hours at COP. And so they involved more than just negotiations, even just within the COP space. So we spent a decent amount of time hunting for coffee, tea, food, or a charging station. And we saw so many famous people speaking. So here is Chellie Pingree when she was there with Nancy Pelosi and Nick Musinski from the UMaine delegation. And then a bunch of other US dignitaries all showed up at various points to tout the IRA or to come to various agreements and consensus points. And we got to observe some of that. It was miles and miles of walking around, so much networking. There's Chloe and Nadia again. And constant reporting out. So this was a really common sight. You'd see just little like media setups all over the place with people reporting out to the rest of the world what they were finding and experiencing at COP and what was happening. And better check the CCTV again because negotiations are probably scheduled. And there were demonstrations happening outside. So like this is outside in terms of like it's open air, but this is within the COP venue that these negotiations were happening. So that was happening pretty much at any time. You could find one negotiation or excuse me, demonstration or another happening. And there was art in progress. This was inside the pavilion area, and so many side events. So that very colorful schedule from my first slide had probably thousands, maybe not quite thousands, but so many side events that you could sift through and try to find the ones that interested you. There were press conferences, and let's see. And there was just a touch of silliness too. So, you know, it was a very serious situation, but you could also find people still being people. So this is a presentation at the end of every day of COP. The Climate Action Network puts on this Fossil of the Day award, and it's very similar to like a street performer kind of vamping. And they give this award to the country that has done the most to do the least, the country that has worked the hardest against climate advocacy advancement. And so on the day that we observed it, they gave it to Egypt and Israel. And then over here on the left, you can see the countries who'd received it on the days before we were there. And so generally the vibe of COP was incredibly intense. There was so much going on at any given time. There were people hurrying from place to place. There was security everywhere. You had to have your badge. Like it was really intense, very hurried because negotiations would pop up on the schedule with minutes to go before they started, and you really wanted to get in there, and you know there were seat maximum, so you were always kind of like, oh gosh, FOMO, like what's happening that I'm not a part of. But it was also incredibly powerful. Like everyone who was there really, at least I felt, understood the kind of the gravitas of the situation. We were all there because we know that this is an issue that needs action now, and we're not there because we think no action can be taken, right? Like we were all there because we know that together we can actually start making some changes. So in that way, it was also really, really hopeful. And it was really energized because just being around all those hopeful and powerful people who were coming together with a shared purpose, like that's super energizing, at least for me. And so my takeaways are that this was a geopolitical negotiation first and a conference second. Some of the members of our delegation were not law people, and they weren't necessarily prepared to process the negotiations. Now, I'm not here to say that I was, but I was at least interested in figuring out how to process those. And the other members of our delegation would express that like the negotiations were really boring or that they were really confusing. And then they'd try to go to a side event and they'd be like, well, but the science here is pretty basic, pretty high level, maybe even a little bit wrong. And these are scientists, they're research professors, they're into like the carbon capture capacity of trees, for example. And so they know this stuff and they're trying to get some conversations about that. And that's not really what COP is about. COP is more, in my experience anyway, about the negotiation than about sharing the science. And so in that way, I found that some people were a little disappointed by their experience at COP. But another takeaway for me was that the negotiation positions are not very nuanced. So I was prepared for I was trying to leave space for like, okay, maybe the US has like other reasons for opposing X, Y, or Z. And maybe, Antigua and Barbuda has, whatever. No, it was pretty much just that the rich countries don't want to be on the hook for paying everything. And the poorer countries, the least developed countries, the small island states, the small island developing states, they all are in pretty dire straits right now, and they what they need is money. So they have very little negotiating power and a lot of demands, and the US and other, EU, et cetera, have a lot of power and are pretty stingy. So that was a disappointment to me, I'll be honest, but it did make it a little easier to follow. And then I was super glad to see a heavy focus globally on equity in EJ. Every conversation that we were in touched on equity in EJ. I thought that this was going to be like a quiet voice in the back of the room going like, hey, me too, I have, there are EJ perspectives and Indigenous people to consider, and what about this? That conversation was happening everywhere that you went, and folks were really doing more. Yes, thank you, Kathleen. And EJ equals environmental justice. So that's kind of the social justice part of it all. So that's representing the experiences of the disempowered folks in the world. And I found that perspective really was there. It wasn't the deciding factor, unfortunately, but I don't think that's necessarily the first step. And so the fact that the perspectives were there, I found to be really positive. And this negotiation is but one piece of the climate action puzzle. So it's really important. It has a lot of potential, but it's not the only thing that the world can do or should do or is doing to combat the climate crisis. And Chloe alluded to this, it ended not with a bang. And that was really disappointing for me, honestly. Like, we'd been following these loss and damages negotiations, the Global Goal on Adaptation, Santiago Network, and then all of a sudden the COP was supposed to be ending. It wasn't ending. We all had plane flights home, and even some of the negotiations started getting closed off to observers. And like she said, things would happen, within 10 minutes, and that was it. And so I found that quite unsatisfactory. And that was just because I didn't know what to expect. I think that's standard. I think that usually happens. I just was unaware of that. And then, as so many things in life, it's all about the people who are there. So my experience of COP was like heavily influenced and impacted by the 4 other folks who were on my delegation with me. And so, being mindful about who you're there with is really important. And also that it's for me. I had an amazing time. What you hopefully got from the vibe slide before, like, it's super engaging and energizing for me. And I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to carry this forward in my life, but it's for me. So I think I went a little overtime. Sorry about that, everyone. But thanks for listening. That's my experience at COP.
You guys see what I mean, right? I mean, how lucky are we to have people like Mikala and Chloe ready to just seize the banner and improve the world for all of us. Thank you so much. And Mikala, no apologies necessary. Before Mikala left, she asked me, well, what do you think people are going to want to know? And I said everything. And so thank you. I feel like I'm sure there is no substitution for actually being there, but I feel like seeing the food that you all ate and the rest that you had and the miles that you walked and all of the navigation of where are the right documents and downloading them in the right language. I mean, it just gives us such an incredible window. And I'm really grateful. Just so you all know, later this afternoon, you will get an email with a link to that portal that Mikala walked us through, so you can try your hand at it yourself. There's a whole bunch of other information there. And there'll be another link specifically to the UN's account of what are the big takeaways, like what do they want us all to think about as the big news coming out of COP. We'll also include a link to the UMaine delegation's blog. So we've got some great stories from Mikala and from Chloe and from Anthony, and there are more stories, and you can follow along through those. So look for that this afternoon. And I have a feeling that lots of us are sitting here thinking, wow, that's so cool. How do I do this? So the first question is, can anybody go to COP as an observer? How did this plan come together, and how did you prepare? Tell us the good stuff so we can start planning our trip to Dubai. Is that right, next year? Okay.
Sure, so I can take that one because no, not just anyone can go. And it took a lot of institutional effort to get our observer status as a university. And that was done primarily by Cynthia Eisenhower and Nick Machinsky at the Maine campus, University of Maine in Orono. There are lots of organizations that have observer status, not many nonprofit organizations, in addition to some universities as well. And then there are also private businesses that have observer status as well. And there's nations that you can go under a party badge, but you need to have a credential, and it needs to come from one of those either observer or party organizations. If you are interested in attending a COP, it is useful to sort of tap the advice I can give you is either to, if attending, if doing more education isn't part of that plan, the other way to get in is to tap your network of NGOs that you may or may not work with, because a lot of NGOs have observer status, and through that observer status can get credentials. Not all of those organizations have the funds nor the desire to actually follow through and get badges and send folks to COP. So if it's something that is of interest to you, there may be an organization that you already work with that has already done the legwork of getting observer status, but just wasn't planning on sending anyone. But if you're willing to foot the bill and pay for your plane ticket and your hotel, they'd be glad to have you there under their badge as an observer. So that's just, if people who are listening who are interested, that is a way in for sure.
I guess it makes sense that not just anybody can go. And thank you for a little bit of the, you see 35,000 people. I should be one of them next time, right? We'll save that for another conversation. But I am curious about, as the plan came together, other than booking flights, finding a place to stay, that kind of thing. How did you prepare? How did you all get ready to feel like, all right, I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna be overwhelmed when I get there, but at least I've done a little bit of homework. What did that look like?
Can I share quickly my take on this? So I showed a little bit in the beginning what I did to prepare, and our delegation also kind of had a moment where we were supposed to research a topic that is related to COP and then present it to each other so that we could info share that way and help each other prepare. I'll be honest, that did not do very much for me. And so I did what I showed you, and I tried to go through the schedules and figure out what was going to be happening. And I tried to visualize myself there and what was it going to be. And I did, to a certain degree, that was helpful and worked, but it really didn't hit me until I understood the sort of churny nature of the negotiations, and that you can't actually really prepare ahead of time. You can prepare by knowing how to find the documents. You can prepare by knowing what topics they're probably going to be talking about and discussing, but especially if you're there in the second week, you don't know what maybe will already have happened in the first week before you got there. You can have a pretty good guess, but being there and checking on the TV, the CCTVs, which you could get on your computers and your phones, you didn't have to find a TV, and being in the negotiations was really, that was what prepared me for the next day and being back in more negotiations. So that was for me.
Yeah, I think kind of building off of that, what I did was just try and talk to my professors who had been to COPs in the past. And my professor, Stacey Ann Robinson, used to be on Jamaica's delegation. So she that's the reason why Colby has gotten observer status, because she's really been the engine behind all of it. She's on sabbatical right now, so I didn't get to talk to her too much, but a little bit. And also some other people, her sabbatical replacement, also had been to a bunch of COPs, so I talked to her a little bit. But in general, kind of like what Mikala was saying, it feels like it's hard to know exactly how to prepare. And I know I felt like that going into it. And I definitely tried my best in researching and reading as much as I could. But what I'm really excited about is now Colby will hopefully be sending other students next year. And I feel like I'm in such a good place that now, having been, I feel like I could really help other people feel more prepared and help other people know what might be helpful to do before going, because without having been there myself, it was hard to know, but now I'm excited to hopefully play that role for people next year.
Oh, And that's one of the many things that makes you such a gem, Chloe. Thank you. I'm curious because, you know, from those of us in the cheap seats, right, following along on the news reports, is what we were reading about COP, like how does that line up compared to what you were seeing in real life? And I'll just give you one example, which is that some of the reporting folks saw indicated that there were a ton of fossil fuel industry lobbyists prowling the streets. Did you see that, or what was it like? And if that's not a good example, pick another one of news stories that you either saw or can contradict.
I say you go, Professor Moffa, on this one.
Sure, I'm happy to go. So I think I read a lot of that reporting as well, and I was kind of expecting, you know, the way it was reported to be like running around COP, seeing people like wearing Exxon Mobil t-shirts and stuff. You know, you didn't really see that. You had to kind of do a little bit of investigative journalism to figure that stuff out. That being said, like I sat next to a gentleman from OPEC's like renewable development fund on the plane into Sharm el-Sheikh, right? So like there were folks. You kind of had to do some digging, but you could find them. And you know, I think just listening to the conversations was also part of it, especially in the not in the observer room, not in the negotiation rooms. You know, that's not where you saw these folks. Most of the time where you saw them was in the country pavilions or in the side events, or just wandering around, like talking to, you know, to different folks. And
I bet they were in the country offices. I bet they got in there somehow, and we weren't in the country offices.
Possibly. And I think a lot of it is, some of that is also colored by the fact, frankly, if I'm being honest and looking at this from a relatively objective standpoint, from a little bit of cynicism about the particular location of the COP this year. There's a lot of, you know, it was located in a region of the world that is dominated by money from fossil fuel interests. And so I think everyone was expecting the COP to be dominated by those interests as well. And I'm sure, like, just by nature of what is accessible geographically, who was closest, you know, that had to have played a factor as well. One of the things that you know, Nick and I remarked on as pretty disturbing was if you walked around the pavilion areas of the different country pavilions, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Emirates pavilions were massive, just and as Nick put it rather eloquently to me, like they're here and they're taking up space both physically and in the conversation, right? And it's sort of it was like a symbolic representation of what you're talking about. And it was really interesting to see, because a lot of times those pavilions would just be empty, like devoid of people, of anyone besides like the representatives from that country. And I'm sure some of them were with ties to oil and gas. But what you didn't see is like the folks like Mikala and Chloe and other students and energized people, you know, engaging with those pavilions really at all, which is, I think, telling as to like whether they really had any influence or they were just kind of sitting there. You know, I'm not sure.
That's really interesting, and a good reminder, as always, to think about what we read, what we see, what we listen to with a little grain of salt, right? That it may or may not be the exactly what you experienced on the ground.
Can I just
Mikala,
really quickly add on to that? I think that there has been some reporting back of like the almost regression on like refusal to agree to non-proliferation of fossil fuels and reducing the use of fossil fuels and targeting the fossil fuel producing companies. I don't think that's a coincidence, but I don't know.
very interesting. We could go all day. I have so many questions, and I've even had the chance to talk to you guys ahead of time. So I know there are a lot of questions we're not getting to, but let's get into the loss and damage program, because that seems to be the biggest sort of centerpiece coming out of COP. Did you have a chance to observe those negotiations, and can you tell us anything about like, where the opposition was coming from? Was it about like how much money, or whether it's necessary that there be money, or was it just about, I don't want to give you the money? What was that like?
Go, Chloe.
Oh, okay. I just have a short story. Nadia, the professor I went with, and I went to the like plenary session that was like the opening of the loss and damage negotiations, which I was kind of confused why they were just opening it the second week when it was supposed to be like such a big deal, but that's a side note. And I forget, I was just trying to find in my notes what exact country was saying this, but I think it was Bangladesh potentially. First what happened is the delegate from New Zealand said, we agree, this is a really important thing, we're like into loss and damage, like it makes a lot of sense to do this, but you need to give us more time. Like you're asking us to bake you a cake and build the kitchen at the same time. And at the time I was like, okay, interesting. And then right after that, I think Bangladesh, I'm not sure, the delegate from there said, you can't tell us that. We've been asking you to build this kitchen to do loss and damage for 30 years. And now you're gonna let us starve because you need time to build the kitchen that we've been telling you we need to build. So I thought that was really powerful, and kind of encapsulated for me what I observed, which is that I didn't hear anyone saying, no, we're not doing this, but it's kind of more of like a undercurrent of like, give us more time, and kind of what that implies. But yeah, Mikala, what were you gonna say?
I mean, that was a really awesome explanation of kind of the party positions, because I super duper agree that I didn't hear anyone saying no loss and damages, it's off the table. But I did hear the kind of the building the kitchen argument of like, we need the funding mechanisms, we need the banks and the financial infrastructure, and we need the kind of boundaries and structures around who pays in, how much do they pay in, who gets to take out, how much do they get to take out, why, what triggers what, how do you decide where this money comes from and where it goes and how much it is. And like Chloe said, these are asks that have been coming for 30 years. So these aren't new asks, and it's well overdue. And Chellie Pingree in her video, she expressed strong support for loss and damages. So it's not that like the US as a whole is against loss and damages, but a really interesting factor that maybe Moffa can expound on a little bit, but that I kind of gathered from listening to him and listening to the negotiations, is that there's a categorization that dates back to the beginning of the FCCC, which is developing nations and developed nations. And it's a bit of a static categorization. There is one way of looking at that is fixed in time, and it's fixed in the early 90s. And so there are some countries that have done a lot of developing since the early 90s. And so if you're building this kitchen, if you're building this loss and damages fund, and you're saying that developing nations are the ones who can withdraw from the fund, but you're saying developing nations based on 1992 or 1995, there's China and India in particular, who are the biggest emitters in the world now. They have developed their economies massively in the last 30 years. But in 1992 and 1995, they were categorized as developing nations. And so China and India are pushing very hard, and many other countries too, it's not just the two of them, but they're pushing very hard for this fund in the expectation that they're going to be able to withdraw from it because they're developing nations. And the US is sitting over here being like, excuse me, China, but I'm not going to pay for that. Like, that's ridiculous. And unfortunately, all the other much less powerful countries are stuck in that kind of tug of war between the two powerful countries. So that is my understanding. And Moffa might be able to clarify. Geopolitics is not my strength. I learned a lot.
Yeah, so the generally speaking, there's what are called Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries to the agreements here. And the non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries. And the sort of elephant in the room, for lack of a better way of describing it, is that China is a non-Annex 1 country because of its historical status as a developing country when this treaty started. But I mean, if we're being real about this, which there were some, the EU and others at COP were doing. They were saying, look at what the current status of the largest emitter in the world and one of the largest economies in the world is China. And to say that they're a non-Annex I country and that they deserve funding from countries in the EU and the United States that's a difficult pill to swallow for those nations, and especially for the United States, which ironically would be effectively borrowing money from China to give it back to China, which is a weird thing to think about. So I would say that if we're talking about loss and damage, just really quickly, it was like a two-phase oppositional setup where in the beginning you had the type of opposition that Chloe's talking about, where these Annex I developed countries were saying, pump the brakes, like we're not ready to do this. We'll study this for 2 more years and we'll agree to do something at COP29 in 2024. And then as the week went on, it was interesting to see them sort of cave on that position and say, okay, we're willing to do something here, but we also now we want to do that. We want to make sure that something doesn't allow countries like China to withdraw from a loss and damage fund. So they kind of shifted their opposition from like complete opposition to like, well, we'll do something, but we want to make sure that we can be careful about who can withdraw. So what we ended up with is what a minister from Antigua and Barbuda described as opening a bank account and not putting anything in the bank account, right? So they basically said that was the position that the developing countries, that's how they walked. That's where the compromise happened. So the developing countries said, we're willing to accept the opening of a bank account without working out the details of who can withdraw from that bank account and who puts into that bank account, as long as everyone agrees to open the bank account today. And so that's where we landed. And we landed with a process to decide who can withdraw and who has to contribute, but without any commitments as to either of those categories yet. And that is what's going to be worked out likely at COP28 and perhaps even into COP29. So we'll see that over the next couple of years, but we have at least opening of the bank account on loss and damage.
But that's like quite fast too, right? Because like there's been a similar sort of discussion for the adaptation fund, and it's been happening over a much longer timeline. So even though this is a really like late to the game conversation, it's still happening on a pretty fast
That's right, Mikala. And I would say the most significant thing in terms of timing here is that loss and damage was the developing countries, Annex I, developed countries in Annex I had successfully prevented loss and damage from even being on the agenda at any prior COP officially. And so this was the first COP where it was officially part of the agenda and we have an agreement on it. And so that's pretty rare to see that kind of quick movement. And it's a testament to the developing countries really working as a block and taking, I think, reasonable negotiating positions along the way to try to get to an agreement. And it really was pretty interesting to watch that happen.
Thank you so much. That kind of explanation that you just gave us, Anthony, is just, that's how we get students who are as brilliant and well-informed and ready to take on the world as Mikala and Chloe are. Thank you. Just so you all know, I call Anthony on a regular basis to say, hey, can you do what he just did for all of us right here? He's in the right line of work. And you are all so, I just am so grateful for all of you. It's hard to believe, but this was our last Lunch and Learn of 2022. We started this program in the early days of those dark March 2020 early pandemic days. I never imagined that we would still be going strong all these months, years later, or that this hour with all of you would be my favorite part of the week every week. I'm so grateful for your partnership in building this community of learning and sharing and reflecting. And I just cannot wait to see what we tackle and explore and learn together in 2023. You will see in that follow-up email later this afternoon a little data point that our Lunch and Learn programs were viewed more than 4,400 times this year. I have a hunch that some of you are responsible for those numbers, and I would love to hear which ones stood out to you. So you'll get a link to the whole Lunch and Learn page, scroll through, take a walk down memory lane, and then send us an email and tell us what was your favorite. And if you've got ideas about what you'd like to explore in the new year, we want to hear those too. We're so grateful for you and hope you have just a wonderful holiday season, and we will see you in the new year. Thank you to Anthony, to Chloe, to Mikala, and of course to Congresswoman Pingree and all of you.